The initial urge and the journey of evolving consciousness. Let us now think of one unconscious soul. In the beginning, the soul had no impressions, sanskaras, and no consciousness. Therefore, at this stage, or in this state, the soul had no gross form or body, subtle body or mental body, because only the existence of gross, subtle, and mental impressions, sanskaras, can give existence to gross, subtle, and mental bodies. And only the existence of these bodies can make possible the existence of gross, subtle, and mental worlds. Hence, in the beginning, the soul had no consciousness of gross, subtle, and mental bodies, and was also unconscious of its own self. And the soul then naturally had no experience of the gross, subtle, and mental worlds, and also had no experience of the oversoul, Paramatma. This infinite, impressionless, unconscious, tranquil state of the soul reverberated with an impulse, which we call the first urge to know itself. The first urge was latent in Paramatma. When we compare Paramatma to an infinite, unlimited ocean, and when we say that Paramatma got the first urge, it could also be said in terms of comparison that the infinite, unlimited ocean got the first urge or the whim. It says, see also Meher Baba, the whim from beyond, beams from Meher Baba on the spiritual panorama. Sufism Reoriented, 1958. In the infinite, both finite and infinite are included. In the capital infinite, both finite and infinite are included. Now, was this first urge infinite or finite? Or was it first finite and then infinite, or vice versa? The first urge was most finite, but this first urge was of the infinite, capital I. The most finite first urge was of the infinite ocean Paramatma, and the manifestation of this latent, most finite first urge of the infinite, capital I, was restricted to a most finite point in the infinite, unlimited ocean. But as this most finite point of manifestation of the latent first urge was most finite too, was in the infinite, unlimited ocean. This most finite point of manifestation of the first urge was also unlimited. Through this most finite point of manifestation of the first urge, also most finite, the shadow of the infinite, capital I, which shadow when of reality is infinite, gradually appeared and went on expanding.
The asterisk
Yes,
has an
Katie,
editor's note.
the asterisk, the sense to be conveyed is that the shadow of the infinite seeped through or oozed out of the most finite point. Okay. This most finite point of manifestation of the latent first urge is called the Om point or creation point, and this point is unlimited. Because of this most gross first impression of the first urge, the infinite soul, capital soul, experienced for the first time.
Back up a paragraph there, Ernie. You skipped this paragraph. Sorry, because I was scrolling. I beg your pardon.
No problem. Simultaneously with reverberations of the first urge, the most gross first impression emerged, objectifying the soul as the most absolute opposite and most finite gross counterpart of the infinite, capital I. Because of this most gross first impression of the first urge, the infinite soul, capital S, experienced for the first time. This first experience of the infinite soul, capital S, was that it, the soul, capital S, experienced a contrariety in its identity with its infinite, impressionless, unconscious state. This experience of contrariety affected changeableness in the eternal, indivisible stability of the infinite soul, capital S, and spontaneously there occurred a sort of eruption, disrupting the indivisible poise and the unconscious tranquility of the infinite soul, capital S, with a recoil or tremendous shock, which impregnated the unconsciousness of the unconscious soul, capital S, with first consciousness of its apparent separateness from the indivisible state of Paramatma. But the soul being infinite, the soul, capital S, being infinite, the first consciousness that it derived from the recoil or shock of an absolutely opposite and most gross first impression of its apparent separateness was naturally and necessarily finite first consciousness. This first consciousness derived by the soul, capital S, is obviously most finite in proportion to the experience of the absolute opposites of its own original infinite state. It then means that in the beginning, when the impressionless infinite soul, capital S, was first impressioned, it got at its first impression, an absolutely gross impression. And the first consciousness the soul, capital S, derived was most finite. Simultaneously at that instant, the unconsciousness of the infinite soul, capital S, actually experienced most finite first consciousness of the most gross first impression. This infinite and eternal soul did get soul, capital S, did get consciousness, but this consciousness by impression was not of its eternal state or its infinite self, capital S, but was of the most finite by the most gross impression. Now, as will be explained later, if the soul is conscious of impressions, sanskaras, then the soul must necessarily experience these impressions. And in order to experience the impressions, the consciousness of the soul must experience them through proper media. As the impressions are, so are the experiences of impressions. And so must be the media to experience the impressions. That is, the impressions give rise to experiences. And to experience the impressions, the use of appropriate media is necessitated.
Thank you, Ernie. Marion, would you continue, please?
Therefore, as the infinite, eternal, and formless soul now has the most finite first consciousness of the most gross first impression, quite obviously and necessarily this most finite first consciousness of the soul must utilize the most finite and most gross first medium to experience the most gross first impression. At this stage, it suffices to mention here for the limited human understanding that the most finite first consciousness of the soul, while experiencing the most gross first impression, centered itself in an appropriate most finite and most gross medium, imperceptibly tending the soul, without form, to associate and identify its very infinite eternal self with this most gross and most finite limited form as its first medium. The first consciousness of the indivisible soul, experiencing the first impression through the first medium, creates a tendency in the soul to associate and identify its eternal infinite self with the first form, the most finite and most gross, which was as the seed of the contrariety spontaneously sown by the reverberations of the first urge, imperceptibly germinated and manifested for the first time in the shape of duality. When it is made to associate and identify itself by its newly gained consciousness with the finite gross form or medium, the consciousness of the soul actually makes the infinite, eternal, indivisible soul without form experience that it is that finite gross form. Thus, the consciousness gained by the unconscious soul, instead of experiencing reality through unity and identity with the oversoul experiences, illusion through duality, and identity with the gross form, multiplying diverse, innumerable impressions in a series of experiences, while associating with the gross form and gradually gaining or evolving more and more consciousness. In order to understand more clearly and concretely how the consciousness gained by the soul gradually develops through the process of evolution, let me read that. In order to understand more clearly and concretely how the consciousness gained by the soul gradually develops through the process of evolution, let us examine that state of the conscious soul where the consciousness of the soul associates itself with stone form as the most finite and most gross medium, and the soul thus begins to identify itself as stone. Actually, the consciousness of the soul utilizes the stone form only after innumerable cycles and ages of diverse experiences through diverse species of forms, of which there are 7 major different kinds of most finite and most gross gaseous forms, which cannot even be concretely grasped nor imagined by ordinary human beings. It is for convenience that we begin with that state of conscious soul when it just begins to associate and identify itself with stone form. In stone form, too, there are varied species, and the consciousness of the soul has to utilize each and all of these species as appropriate media, one after the other, in accordance with the diversity of impressions of the soul, to experience varied and countless impressions gathered one after the other in stone form. If we take stone as a medium for most gross impressions, it follows that the soul, which is eternally in the oversoul, now with most finite consciousness, experiences most gross impressions through the medium of stone form. It is thus that the infinite, indivisible, eternal soul, parens, without form, which is eternally in the oversoul, while experiencing the most finite gross impressions through its own most finite consciousness, utilizes the most finite gross medium of the firstmost species of stone, paren, first most, meaning the very, very first. And the soul is thus imperceptibly, though spontaneously, made to identify itself as stone. After ages and cycles, the most finite gross consciousness is gradually much more evolved in the soul by innumerable and varied experiences of the most gross finite impressions through the identification of the soul with the firstmost species of stone. Eventually, when a limit to having experiences is reached, the identification of the soul with the firstmost species of stone is gradually dissociated, and that stone form is dropped. The soul remains now for a period without any medium, though the most finite consciousness, which has been evolved, remains together with the most gross finite impressions of the most first species of stone form just shed. Thus the soul, now without any medium or form, is conscious of the most finite impressions, sanskaras. But as long as consciousness is centered in impressions, the soul must necessarily experience those impressions. Therefore, in order to experience the impressions of the most first species of stone form dropped, the consciousness of the soul centered in the impressions of the dropped stone form begins to associate with the most next species of stone form. The soul identifies itself with this species of stone, and the consciousness of the soul begins to experience, through association with the new medium of the most next species of stone form, the impressions of the most first species of stone form. The most important point to be understood here is that when the consciousness of the soul dissociates its identification from one form or medium and retains only the impressions of the form so dissociated, these impressions are experienced through another appropriate medium when the consciousness of the soul associates with the next medium or form. But this next medium or form is always created and molded of the consolidated impressions of the last species of form with which the soul associated and identified itself, and which, impressions, were retained by the consciousness of the soul, even when dissociated from the form. Thus, innumerable diverse experiences of countless impressions experienced by the consciousness of the soul through diverse species of stone forms, one after the other, lead to the greater evolution of consciousness of the soul. Ultimately, a stage is reached after ages and cycles of experiences where the consciousness of the soul has a tendency to dissociate the soul even from the most last species of stone form. And although the most last species of stone form is dissociated or dropped by the soul, the most finite consciousness evolved thus far remains together with the most finite gross impressions of the most last species of stone form dropped.
Thank you, Marian. Mahu?
Yes.
Could you continue?
Sure.
Thank you.
The soul, now without any medium or form, is conscious of the most finite gross impressions, or sanskaras, of the most last species of a stone form. The soul must necessarily experience these impressions. It is thus that the infinite, eternal.
Sorry, you skipped this one.
Oh,
Sorry,
I'm sorry.
I was scrolling.
Okay. Now, in order to experience the impressions of the most last stone form, the soul associates and identifies with another medium, the metal form. This medium of metal form is but the mold of the impressions of the most last species of a stone form. In other words, the most first species of metal form is created and molded of the most last species of stone form's impressions. It is thus that the finite eternal soul without form, which is eternally in the oversoul, experiences through evolved consciousness the most gross finite impressions of the most last species of a stone form, while associating and identifying itself with the most first species of metal form.
Excuse me, Mahu. I believe it says infinite eternal soul. Perhaps you said that, but I heard finite.
Oh, okay. So let's read it again. Let's read this paragraph again. It is thus that the infinite eternal soul without form, which is eternally in the oversoul, experiences through evolved consciousness the most gross finite impressions of the most last species of a stone form, while associating and identifying itself with the most first species of metal form. There are diverse species of metal form just as there are of a stone form, and the consciousness of the soul utilizes these diverse innumerable species of metal form as media through which to experience the diverse and innumerable impressions gathered. Thus, the evolution of the consciousness of the soul gains and gathers momentum in proportion to the diverse and multiple experiences of varied and innumerable impressions through different media or species of forms. This is how the cycles of evolution of consciousness of the soul go on evolving further and greater consciousness with evolution of forms of higher and higher species, while experiencing and exhausting the impressions of the disassociated forms of the lower and lower species. The consciousness of the soul experiences and exhausts all the impressions of the most last species of a stone form through the medium of the most first species of metal form. When all the impressions of the most last species of a stone form are exhausted, the consciousness of the soul disassociates itself from the most first species of metal form and drops that form. But the consciousness now retains the impressions of the most first, where am I? Now retains the impressions of the most first species of the metal form. You want to read the abstract while rolling it up all the way, please? Yeah. The reader should not think of oft appearing mosts, such as most first, most next, most finite, or most finite or superfluous or redundant, because each species of a certain form, stone, for instance, has numerous repetitions with a slight variations before going on to the most next species of that same form, and it seemed necessary to differentiate. Now, most last, in quotation, is used to mean the form most recently encountered, such as the highest and latest evolutionary form of the species, and should not be construed as the form furthest down the scale. This note was with, by the editor. Now go back to the text. These impressions of the most first species of the metal form are now experienced by the conscious soul through its association and identification with the most next species of metal form. This form is but the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most first species of metal form, which was dropped or disassociated by the conscious soul. A chain of varied species of metal forms is thus created, and the soul, or to be more precise, the consciousness of the soul, associates with and disassociates from every species of the metal form, exhausting and gaining diverse impressions. While experiencing these impressions, the soul evolves more and more consciousness simultaneously with the evolution of the higher and higher species of forms. After ages and cycles, at last the consciousness of the soul associates and identifies itself with the most last species of metal form to experience the impressions of the most last, but one species of metal form that the soul has just dropped or disassociated.
Thank you, Mahu. I'll take a turn reading now. This soul, eternally in the oversoul, though being infinite and without form, finds itself as metal. While identifying itself with diverse species of metal form, the soul begins to experience simultaneously the gross world in accordance with and in proportion to the soul's experiences of the stone form and the metal form. The metal form, which includes a series of diverse species of metal, is as inorganic, inanimate, and solid as the stone form, which includes a series of diverse species of stone. The soul, or more precisely, the consciousness of the soul, while identifying itself with the species of stone and metal forms, finds itself as one with the stone or metal form, and thus realizes itself as inorganic, inanimate, and solid, and experiences these inorganic, inanimate, and solid states throughout the entire evolution of the stone and metal forms in the gross world. The solid, inanimate state of the soul is one in which life and energy are still dormant, in spite of greater evolution of consciousness. Hence, the forms in this solid state cannot, of their own accord, move about by themselves. That is, they cannot have voluntary motion, and therefore the consciousness of the soul associating with these solid forms, which are inanimate and inorganic, and with life and energy still dormant in them, tends to assert recumbent, horizontal positions rather than to assert vertical, upright stands or erect positions in the gross world. After ages and cycles of varied, innumerable gross experiences of diverse and innumerable impressions through a variety of species of metal forms, the consciousness of the soul eventually dissociates itself even from the most last species of metal form. Thus, the identity of the soul with the most last species of metal form is dropped. And as usual, the conscious soul now is once again temporarily unidentified with any form. That is, the soul is now without any form. In this state of the conscious soul, when there is no form with which to be associated, the consciousness of the soul is centered only in the impressions of the most last species of metal form, which has now been dropped. Thus, the conscious soul in this state of having no form for identification is conscious only of the impressions of the most last species of metal form. The conscious soul must exhaust these impressions of the most last species of the metal form by the consciousness of the soul experiencing these impressions through some appropriate medium. And the appropriate medium to spend or exhaust these impressions of the most last species of metal form is the most first species of vegetable form. This species of vegetable form is nothing but the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most last species of the metal form. When the consciousness of the soul associates now with the most first species of vegetable form, the soul, thus conscious, tends to identify itself with that form and actually finds itself as that species of vegetable form, quite oblivious of the reality that it, the soul, is infinite, eternal, and without form, eternally in the Oversoul, Paramatma. In this state of the most first species of the vegetable form, the consciousness of the soul experiences the gross world in accordance with and in proportion to the impressions it experienced and experiences of the stone forms, metal forms, and vegetable form, respectively. While thus experiencing the gross world, this consciousness of the soul, identified with the vegetable form, realizes now that it is vegetable and has half inanimate and half animate attributes. The conscious soul now asserts in the gross world, through this vegetable form, an upright, erect stand. Although this form cannot stand independently by itself, it uses the support of other media to assert an upright stand. This form is still not capable, however, of giving the experience of voluntary movement to the consciousness of the soul. After the impressions of the last most species of the metal form are exhausted by the consciousness of the soul through the most first species of vegetable form, this most first species of vegetable form is dropped. That is, the consciousness of the soul dissociates itself from this most first species of vegetable form. Ernie, could you please continue?
Again, the conscious soul realizes that it is without a form, although the evolved consciousness is there. This evolved consciousness of the soul is now centered in the impressions of the most first species of the vegetable form just dropped or dissociated. To experience these impressions of the most first species of vegetable form, the consciousness of the soul, now without any form, utilizes an appropriate medium, which is the most next species of the vegetable form. This most next species of the vegetable form is nothing but the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most first species of vegetable form. By association with the medium of the most next species of vegetable form, the consciousness of the soul experiences in the gross world the impressions of that last species of the vegetable form just dropped. When these impressions are exhausted through diverse experiences, the consciousness of the soul relinquishes its association with the most next species of vegetable form and again experiences that it, the soul, is without gross form and that its consciousness is centered only in the impressions of that species of form last dropped. Again, to experience these impressions, the consciousness of the soul tends the soul to identify with the next species of vegetable form. This chain of impressions, experiences, and species of form from one form to another is so linked that it is apparently endless, and the consciousness of the soul, in order to evolve itself fully and completely, has no other course but to become entangled in this vicious circle until, perforce, the consciousness of the soul, thus gained, makes the soul realize that it is infinite, eternally, and eternally in the oversoul, and makes the soul experience infinite power, knowledge, and bliss. The point that is important and which is to be carefully noted is that as the cycle of evolution of consciousness of the soul rolls on, and further and greater consciousness is evolved through experiences of further and greater impressions, this evolution of consciousness inadvertently evolves a series of forms of higher and higher species, while exhausting the impressions of the lower and lower species that get dissociated or dropped or shed. Thus, the gap between the beginning and the end of a series of species of one particular form, such as the stone form, or metal form, or vegetable form, or other forms, beginning with the lowest or crude most first species of a form of particular kind, and ending with the highest or sublime most last species of form of that particular kind is progressively filled in by the evolution of forms of higher and higher types suitable to the impressions and aiding the consciousness of the soul to gain higher and higher consciousness. In short, in between the most first and most last species of form of a particular form, there are diverse species of forms of that particular form evolved to suit the requirements of the evolving consciousness of the soul.
Thank you, Ernie. Marion, could you continue? Oh, you're muted, Marion.
There I go. There. Coming to the point, when the consciousness of the soul associates itself with the most last species of vegetable form, the conscious soul identifies itself with this most last species of vegetable form and experiences the impressions of the most last, but one species of the vegetable form that was last shed. When all the impressions of this most last, but one species of vegetable form are exhausted, the conscious soul no longer identifies itself with the most last species of vegetable form, because the consciousness of the soul has dissociated itself from that most last species of vegetable form. This most last species of vegetable form is also eventually shed by the conscious soul after ages and cycles of experience of the whole vegetable kingdom through the gross world, on the earth and in the waters. Although the most last species of vegetable form is shed by the conscious soul, and the soul is now without any form, yet the consciousness evolved is there. And through this consciousness, the soul, though without form, is conscious of the impressions of the most last species of the vegetable form just shed. These impressions must necessarily be spent or exhausted. In order to experience these impressions, the consciousness of the soul now associates with an appropriate medium to experience these impressions of the most last species of the vegetable form. Therefore, the consciousness of the soul thus tends the soul to identify itself with the most first species of the worm form. It must be remembered that this form of the most first species of worm form is nothing other than the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most last species of vegetable form. While the conscious soul thus identifies itself with this most first species of worm form, the soul realizes that it is actually a worm and becomes worm conscious. Despite all of the consciousness so far evolved, the soul is still not conscious of its reality, its original, infinite, eternal state, eternally in the Oversoul. Although the soul is eternally in the Oversoul and is infinite and without form, this partially conscious soul actually experiences itself as a worm in the gross world. This is ignorance. This ignorance persists as long as the consciousness of the soul is not fully evolved. But even when the soul has come to full consciousness, it is still said to be enveloped by ignorance, because this fully evolved consciousness does not make the soul self-conscious instantaneously. On the contrary, When the consciousness of the soul is fully evolved, the soul begins to identify itself as a human being.
Thank you, Marian. Mahu, would you care to continue?
Yes, I can continue. While the consciousness of the soul associates itself with the most first species of warm form, it experiences and exhausts the impressions of the most last species of the vegetable form. When all the impressions of the most last species of vegetable form are completely exhausted or spent through the diverse experiences had by the soul while identified with the most first species of warm form, then this most first species of warm form is dropped or disassociated, and the soul is once again without any form, although it is conscious of the impressions of the most first species of warm form. These impressions of the most first species of warm form must be experienced and exhausted. Therefore, the consciousness of the soul associates itself with another appropriate medium and tends the soul to identify with the most next species of warm form. This medium of the most next species of warm form is nothing other than the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most first species of warm form. Species after species of warm form are thus molded and dropped while the consciousness of the soul rapidly evolves through experiencing the varied impressions of warm forms through diverse species of warm forms. When the conscious soul is warm conscious and experiences itself as a worm in the gross world, the consciousness of the soul also has, for the first time, the experience of voluntary movement and also experiences that it is an animate creature. This warm conscious soul in its travel to gain more and greater consciousness also experiences itself in the gross world as an invertebrate and at a later stage in other states of vertebrate, limbless, creeping worm forms of diverse species. In other diverse species of worm form, the consciousness of the soul undergoes further varied experiences of voluntary movement through crawling, through pairs of legs, and sometimes through multiple pairs of legs, and sometimes through pairs of legs and pairs of wings. Sometimes the warm conscious soul in varied species of warm form realizes itself as possessing a hairy surface, sometimes a smooth and silky, and sometimes a rough or a scaly surface or hide. The warm conscious soul also realizes more acutely that it has to struggle for its sustenance and also for its survival, and that is endowed with sensation and life. Do you want me to continue?
Yeah, yes, couple more paragraphs, please,
Okay.
Mahu.
This warm conscious soul, before their evolution of consciousness, through greater and varied innumerable experiences of varied and multiple impressions of varied species of worm form, also experiences and realizes that it is an amphibian, that it has not only voluntarily movement on earth, but also freedom and mobility in water. For our own convenience in understanding the evolution of consciousness more clearly, we include in the work form the varied species of worms, varied species of insects, varied species of reptile, and varied species of amphibia. In short, we include in the worm form all the species that tend to crawl or that crawl in spite of having limbs, legs, and wings, or that are otherwise distinct from birds and quadrupeds.
Thank you, Mahu.
Yeah.
The stone and metal forms had no upright or erect stand. They were recumbent forms. Their posture was flat and horizontal. The vegetable form had an upright, erect stand. Now the worm form is again of the recumbent type of form, which has no upright or erect stand, but is prone to have a prostrate posture. When the consciousness of the soul associates itself with the most last species of worm form after experiencing all the impressions of the varied species of worm form, and when the conscious soul eventually drops or sheds this most last species of worm form after ages and cycles of multiple diverse experiences in the gross world, the conscious soul again finds itself without any association or identification with forms. But the consciousness of the soul is now centered in the impressions of the most last species of worm form just shed. These impressions must necessarily be exhausted through experience, and to get experience, a suitable medium is necessary. Therefore, the consciousness of the soul being centered in the impressions of the most last species of worm form associates with an appropriate medium and tends the soul to identify itself with the most first species of fish form in order to experience and exhaust the impressions of the most last species of worm form. This most first species of fish form is nothing other than the consolidated mold of the impressions of the most last species of worm form. So we'll continue next week.